Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of our podcast. At the end of the day, this is me, Anuz Thapa.
And this is me, Dipika Shrestha. This podcast is a weekly guide for the newly arriving immigrants in the US. And with us today is Carlos P. Beltran. Carlos, welcome to our podcast.
Thank you.
Carlos has produced stories for major media houses like the National Geographic, Discovery Communications, Aljazeera, Univision, MSNBC, and many more. And right now, he produces stories for NBC Left Field, which is NBC Universal's documentary unit.
So, Carlos is a multimedia journalist and he is originally from Caracas, Venezuela. You studied journalism and mass communications from the University of Kansas
Correct.
in 2009.
Right.
And then you were here for a while and then you went back home and now you have been working in the journalism profession in the US for the last 3 years.
Yeah,
right?
correct.
So, in today's podcast, we are going to talk about how
To get inspired. I believe that our conversation will be really helpful to the aspiring journalists in the US. And by the way, Carlos, the reason why we chose this topic is we were researching about you. Obviously, that's what journalists do. And then we stumbled upon a blog on your blog site, which was titled How to Get Inspired.
Right. I was in Brooklyn at my favorite dive bar close to like 5 or 6 p.m. And I think it must have been around that time. And I was looking for stories. I was at that time doing stories for the New York Post, about 3 years ago, I think. And I had spent the day just walking around Bushwick and Brooklyn Heights, just around the Brooklyn area, trying to find interesting characters. And then all of a sudden, I just stopped for a beer at this place, and it just, I don't know, I guess I was pushing myself to try and see, well, what else can I do to actually find this story? And then very soon I heard people talking, and one of them was an artist, a guy who made a living from drawing the covers of many of the cheesiest romantic novels that you find on the airport or whatnot. So I met that guy there. So again, and I thought, well, I have so many people asking me how to get inspired. I'm not saying to go get drunk at a bar at 5, on a Friday night or a Thursday afternoon, but just listening to people at a place where they're, just talking, inhibitedly. I thought that was pretty funny. And then that's it. I think in that blog, I tell people to maybe go for a run. They do the opposite. Either go for a run and that'll get things moving in your head, and that's great for ideas. I find some of my best ideas over there. But if not, just go to a bar, as I have to be in Brooklyn, and then just, have a drink and listen to people. I usually strike up conversations very easily with people at bars. It's just very unpretentious. It just flows, and then you can ask people, you can tell people I'm a journalist, I'm working for stories, and then everybody has a story. Right. They'll want to tell you about this friend of a friend of a friend who does something, and yeah, maybe if you're lucky, they'll have a story that you can just grasp onto and tell.
But how do you start the conversation?
The thing is, it also depends on your personality, right? Like the first thing that I say is not, hey, I'm a journalist, I'm looking for stories, what's your story? I mean, I think last time, before then, I started a conversation with a veteran. It was Veterans Day, and the guy had a patch, and I'm like, well, thank you for your service and everything. Can I buy you your next beer? Oh, thank you. And then he asks me a question, and then very soon strike up a conversation. I mean, it's very difficult for me to tell you how to begin a conversation with a stranger at a bar because there's no formula. Right. If you're an amicable, nice, friendly human being, then most likely, it'll happen. Very natural. But yeah.
Okay. And Carlos, most of the times you have been a freelancer journalist.
Yeah.
So how challenging is it to be a freelance journalist?
The question is how hard? Well, I'm hoping that it's not too hard that you'll want to quit doing it.
Right.
To me, I just love being able to just find different stories and pitch them. To me, that's the adrenaline of being able to tell these stories, and that assured me that since I had to make every story count because I had to actually make a living doing that, then I had to be very passionate about every story. I had to turn in an incredible story that the network would like to publish, and then that pressed me to do the best in terms of shooting, the journalism that goes into these stories, editing, etc. And yeah, which is why I was able to do plenty of stories for name the network, and I worked with them. Yeah.
Right. And Carlos, how do you make your story universal? Meaning, you go to Venezuela, you find some story, but that story might not be the the people from US, they might not relate to that story.
Here's my quick answer. I try to always put myself in the shoes of someone who knows nothing of that culture, right? And if I need to give context in the story, here is Caracas, Venezuela, or here is Bogota, Colombia, or a favela in Rio de Janeiro. This is what these people go through every day, and this is what we care about this one story over here. If it feels like a journey, everybody loves a good journey. And that, I think that's what I've tried to make my stories on. From like drug dealers to cameraman in New York or photographers in New York City, if the story has something emotional that people can connect to, then that's great. I think intimacy is also something that I try to have in all of my pieces. If you ask questions that are intimate, if you get to know this person, you know, in a way that you clearly see that they're opening up to the camera, then that's very interesting to people to watch. I mean, whoever, wherever you are, that it's interesting to see someone opening up to you about very sensible issues or their lives or their hardships. Not to be sensationalist, but that's how you get to know someone, by them opening up.
Is there a difference in the way you would approach a character or approach a story and produce a story in Venezuela when we compare that with in the US?
Short answer, ethically speaking, from a journalistic point of view, it should be the same in terms of production. Different is that I know how, you know, I feel like I'm in my place there and I can just move around quite easily and weave through plenty of contacts and people. I know how to talk to people there, you know.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, in addition to that, you were not born in America and not brought up in America. So does that put you in a, you know, disadvantageous place or in a backseat in terms of approaching to people?
I don't think so, really. I mean, especially if you're a journalist, then I would think that before you go into an interview or approach a theme or a topic, you do your research. So if you're going to interview or do a story about a community that you're not well acquainted with, then you do your research. You'll ask what's appropriate, what's not, etc. Like, so I would think as journalists, again, you would make yourself sensible to those possible differences in costumes, so that you don't offend anyone if that's what you're asking while asking questions. And I also, every time that I sit down with someone and for an interview, camera interview, or whatnot, I would have sat down with them at least once without a camera, just to get to know them, especially if you're talking about something very intimate, right? I know that this is not something that every story has. Not every journalist there has the time to actually sit down with someone for a coffee or tea right before they actually shoot the story. But that's one of the things that I'm lucky enough to have in the stories that I tell, is that if they're sensitive enough, then I'll spend the time to learn about the person, learn about the culture, so that I don't offend anyone. Part of my ignorance. This is something I always say if I'm talking about a topic or trying to do a story on a topic that I don't quite fully understand yet. It's part of my ignorance. I might not know everything, so if something comes off as you know, wrong, please correct me. You know, and then they know that you're genuine. They know that you're honest and how you're approaching it. No.
Is there any example that you would like to share where you had to rework on your story?
I was doing a story about a year ago on the right to die, right? And there's this term that is used, either euthanasia or assisted suicide is something that's used very often. And the community that supports the right to die, the right for people to choose when to end their lives, they hate the term assisted suicide. So I got that on an email. I sent an email to one of the people that I was going to interview, and they said, by the way, we don't really like or use the sentence assisted suicide. We feel like it's offensive. And I said, pardon me, obviously I'm trying to learn as I go along with this story, and they were perfectly fine with it. And then once I met them, I never used that term again. So again, it's not necessarily about a culture, but it's about maybe a group or a community of people and how not to offend them. So, you know, be open. You might make mistakes, but if you're not doing them out of just complete sheer voluntary ignorance, then they'll understand.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh yeah,
and
absolutely.
If our audience wants to get in touch with you, would you be comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely. I have a website with there's some tutorials for freelance journalists on my website that I wrote and produced many years ago. It's carlospbeltran.com.
By the way, at the end of the podcast, is there any advice you want to give out to the aspiring immigrant journalist in the US?
Very practical advice. There are plenty of networks for international journalists in the U.S., not only here in New York. A good friend of mine, Sky Robbins, founded the Video Consortium. That's a great resource for people to look at. It's a Facebook group. There's also plenty of networks out there for freelancers. Story Hunter is a network that connects you with editors from networks from all over the world if you're a freelance journalist. So I'd say that, but it's plenty of resources like that you just log in, search for other international journalists, and go on meetups. And networking is incredibly important also. So yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Carlos, for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank you guys.
So yeah, please subscribe to our channel at the end of the day and keep supporting us.
And you can find our podcast on all the podcast apps, including on Spotify, iTunes, Anchor app, and then you can also watch us on YouTube. And then please log on to our official website, which is podcast@theendoftheday.com. Send us your feedback and keep watching us, keep listening to us. So see you next week.
Yes, bye-bye.
Hey guys, a quick note. If you have a personal story that you think might be helpful to the newly arriving immigrants in the US, please contact us. We would love to feature you in our podcast. Go to our website, podcast@theendoftheday.com, and write to us by going to the feedback section.
And by the way, if you love this podcast, you can support us with a small donation. Your help will enable us to continue producing more episodes. The link to support our podcast is in the description below.